evening. Glad to have you here with us this evening for our evening Bible study. This month, we've got 5 Sundays all told in the month of May. Our 5th Sunday, we are planning to do a question and answer service that 5th Sunday evening. That leaves us 3 more Sundays in the month. These 3 Sundays, we're going to be looking at the topic of marriage. Contrary to what Mr. John Wakefield suggested, we're not necessarily exempting anybody from this. However long you've been married, you can probably still learn a thing or two. You can certainly share some stuff with those that have not been married as long. And obviously we've got some younger people here that we hope one day will be married, and so we want to be doing what we can to help prepare them for that. This first lesson, I'm going to just look at some basics, but hopefully maybe look at them in a way that in a couple of ways that we have not necessarily looked at them before. So even if you are aware of this, maybe it'll be a little bit kind of fresh in its presentation. I've titled this lesson, Defining Marriage. So how would you define marriage? One man and one woman for life. It's a union. It's a partnership. I like all of these things. These are a lot of things, and we're going to discuss these more fully. I asked the question because, of course, the dictionary definition keeps changing on us. Most recently, Merriam-Webster defines marriage as the state of being united as spouses in a consensual and contractual relationship recognized by law. Is there anything about this definition that stands out to you? Okay. There are a lot of things. One, you said, doesn't say man and woman. It doesn't say one man, one woman. As a matter of fact, neither gender nor number are specified in this definition. Ms. Karen, what were you saying? There's no mention of God. It is emphasizing exclusively the civil or legal side of it. Something else I also thought that was missing. I say there's nothing said about duration. And these are things that I think as we approach the topic of marriage from the biblical perspective, we're going to see that all of these things are important. But you look at your contemporary societal definition of marriage, and they're all lacking. Even if we understand part of it, our personal definition might not be as complete as it needs to be. You've probably heard the famous example from Abraham Lincoln. How many legs does a dog have if you call his tail a leg? And of course the answer is 4. Saying that a tail is a leg doesn't make it a leg. Well, similarly, calling some union a marriage doesn't necessarily make it a marriage. And so for our few moments here of class this evening, I'm going to ask some basic questions, but each one of these illustrates a key point, a key aspect of finding that accurate, complete definition of marriage. The first one, and if you were in our Bible class this morning, our adult auditorium class this morning, you may recognize the question, is the origin of marriage human or divine? Now, according to logic, you have what is referred to as the law of excluded middle, which says that for every precisely defined statement, it's either true or false. There is no in between. And so, for example, when it comes to the topic of marriage, it is either from heaven or it is not from heaven. It is either from God or it is not from God, meaning it is from men. That's the same question, right, that Jesus presented the Pharisees with, asking them about the baptism of John. Was it from heaven or from men? And do you remember what their reasoning was? We talked about that this morning in Matthew 21. Specifically, why were they afraid to say that the marriage of John was from heaven? They did not obey it. All right, what does that imply? If something is from heaven, what are we under the obligation to do? We're under obligation to obey it. If something is from heaven, if something is divine, the man is under obligation to obey it, and man has no authority to change it. In other words, this is not a trivial matter, right? If marriage is from God, then there are divinely ordained standards, components, pieces of marriage that man has no authority to change. Now, rather than just jumping right into the answer that I know we all want to give, I want to consider the other side of it just for a moment. That is, let's consider, is it possible for marriage to be from men? Well, what we see now is from men, but the origin of marriage. If marriage was originally from man, what are some things that we might expect to be true? Okay, we would expect that it could change. We would expect that it has changed. How about this? If marriage was from man, wouldn't we expect to find biological evidence for marriage? After all, you take God out of the picture, you don't allow God into your explanation for where humanity came from, and what answer are you left with? Evolution. That man came from animals, that everything that you see in human society is just an evolution, a refinement, an advancement over what exists in the animal kingdom. If that is the case, we would expect to find rudimentary forms, evolutionary steps towards marriage within the animal kingdom, would we not? As a matter of fact, some evolutionists have argued that marriage has simply evolved from the monogamous relationship that we see in some animals. We do know some animals mate for life, including just a handful of coyotes. I didn't know that. Apparently coyotes mate for life. Geese, lobsters mate for life. However, did you know this? 90% of bird species are monogamous. Only about 5% of animal species are. Now, that's a significant number, because from a biological perspective, is man more a bird or man more a mammal? We're more a mammal. And yet, we differ from most mammals. We're more like the birds. It doesn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective. As a matter of fact, you've probably heard this. Evolutionists love to tell us that our closest living relative, genetically, biologically speaking, is what? The ape, and specifically the chimpanzee. Chimpanzees are fiercely and aggressively polygamous. You do not see monogamous relationships among the chimpanzees. So right away, we're starting to realize this idea of marriage being from man doesn't really make sense. It's also the case that if marriage were from man, the origin of marriage wasn't man, we would expect to see vast societal differences regarding marriage throughout its history. In other words, we would expect different types of unions to be considered marriages, some cultures having no concept of marriage. But in fact, what we find when we look at anthropology, the history of humanity, is that marriage has been a universal practice. Dr. Ashley Montague, an anthropologist, wrote, "There are no societies in which marriage does not exist." Further, while homosexuality obviously is not a new practice, the evidence of history is that homosexual marriages are a new practice. There is no evidence from anthropology, from the history of mankind, for a homosexual union being called a marriage prior to 2001. Meaning, even if you go from a biblical perspective, you're talking about 6,000 years of human history where it was strictly a relationship between a man and a woman. Instead, what we find is that marriage is universal, and it's very, very old. Laws of marriage are found in the very oldest known law codes. The law code of Hammurabi, which you've probably learned about back in school somewhere along the way, dates back to about 2100 BC. Predates the law of Moses by 700 years. There's about 40 different laws in the law code of Hammurabi describing marriage. What all of that points to is a divine origin for marriage. And as a matter of fact, the Bible confirms the divine origin of marriage. Start first of all, Genesis chapter 2, verses 21 and 22. Familiar passage. Jehovah God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept and took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof, and the rib which Jehovah God had taken from the man, made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. What's going on here? Not only the creation of woman, but what? This is the first marriage, is it not? This is God bringing the woman and presenting her to the man. Jesus, when he was questioned about divorce, said, Matthew 19, verse 4, have ye not read that he who made them from the beginning, made them male and female, and said, now this is, you read Genesis account, and it's not clear who says that a man shall leave his father and mother. Jesus clarifies for it. It is God speaking. The one who made them, that's God, right, also said, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So that they are no more two, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. It was God who pronounced Adam and Eve as husband and wife, pronounced them one flesh. It was God who joined them together. Now what that means, ultimately, is that marriage is from God. It is a divine institution, and God, not man, determines the definition. In other words, it doesn't matter what I personally think or feel. It doesn't matter what any earthly court rules. It doesn't matter which way public opinion shifts. Who gave us marriage? God did. So who sets the standards and the definitions of marriage? God does. By the way, marriage is a divine institution, but it is not a uniquely Christian institution. Do you understand the distinction? All right? What am I saying when I say that it's divine but not necessarily or uniquely Christian?
Well, it's just like the flood, history of the flood. I mean, every religion has a flood account. We know that God created the flood. God created marriage.
Yes.
And just because you don't believe in God, like maybe you have this other God, the truth is still there.
The truth of marriage still exists. That's an excellent way to put it. You know, again, you look at Matthew chapter 19. Jesus is being asked specifically about divorce and why did Moses permit divorce. And he makes a statement in verse 8 saying, Moses, for your hardness of heart, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it hath not been so. Before there was Christianity, for that matter, before there was Judaism or any other formerly titled religion, there was what? There was marriage given by God. There was a definition given in the beginning that all mankind were expected to recognize and adhere to, and that's the same definition, the same standard that Jesus is simply reiterating in Matthew chapter 19. There's a significant point here, because a lot of times, specifically when it comes to Matthew 19 and questions about divorce and remarriage and what constitutes a marriage, people will argue you're trying to apply a Christian standard to worldly people. But where did marriage come from? It comes from God. Not from Christianity specifically. It comes from God. It was given by God to all mankind, and thus all mankind is amenable to God's laws regarding marriage. Where did it come from? It comes from God. Second major question I want to consider, what is the composition of marriage? And specifically, there's sort of two sub-questions to that I'm interested in. What is the gender of the persons in a marriage? And what is the number of persons in a marriage? All right? We'll start with gender. And marriage, as defined in the Bible, is always between a man and a woman. You go back to the very beginning. Think about the creation. God creates the earth on day one, and what does he say about the earth? It is good. And so he then begins to create light and the stars, and he says it is good, and he creates the seas and the dry land, and it is good, and he goes through and he creates all the animals and the birds and the fish and man, and it is good. Until sometime on that sixth day, according to Genesis 2 and verse 18, God takes note of something that he says is not good, which is what? That man was alone. Here is something that is not good. And so God says, I will make a help meet for him, a help suitable, a help proper for him. And what does God create? A woman. Significantly, what does God not create? Another man, a male. He creates a woman, a female. And we are told in Genesis 2 and verse 24, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. That's the same standard, the same union that Jesus taught in Matthew 19, verses 4 and following, because he's quoting from these same passages. It's the same standard that Paul taught. 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 2, Paul says, but because of fornications, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Wherever you look in the Bible and you read about marriage, it is always a union between a man and a woman. Beyond that, wherever you look in the Bible, homosexual unions are always condemned in Scripture. Leviticus 18 and verse 22, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. Romans 1, 26 and 27. For this cause God gave them up unto vile passions, for their women changed the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust toward one another, men with men, working unseemliness, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was due. Marriage, as defined by God, was a union between male and female. FYI, and unfortunately this has to be said, that also forbids any union of man and beast or any union of man and inanimate object as being considered a marriage, right? Because point number one, who gave us marriage? God did. And what did God say about the gender of the partners in marriage? Man and a woman. All right. What about number? Well, maybe you've seen this chart. I realize you probably can't read it all. It's a chart that has been put out by a group of atheists criticizing that concept of biblical marriage. The way it typically goes is somebody will say, well, I support the biblical definition of marriage. And they'll say, okay, which one? Well, what do you mean, which one? Well, they say, look, we've got all of these different things that are described in the Bible as marriage. You've got a man and a woman is described as a marriage. You've got a man plus a multitude of wives or a multitude of concubines is described as a marriage. You've got a man and a woman and her handmaiden, like we have with Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar in Genesis verse 16. And that's called a marriage. You might have a man and a woman and a woman and a woman and a woman and a woman, all 700 of them like Solomon had. And that's called a marriage. You might have a man and the wife of his dead brother. That's levirate marriage. We read about that in the Bible. This one right here, and by the way, this ought to tell you just how much they are really not interested in the truth. That actually reads a man, a rapist, and his victim. That is a terrible, terrible, willful, I would say, misunderstanding of what we read about in Deuteronomy chapter 22. But they will say, look, there's another type of marriage in the Bible. A soldier and a prisoner of war would be described as a marriage. Or a male slave and a female slave, that is, a male slave being given a wife by his master, would be described as a marriage. Interestingly, as you look at these different things that are summarized under the general type of marriage, what is rather conspicuous by its absence? Well, that's on here. There is nothing in the Bible, there is no place where two men or two women is ever called a marriage. Really, all of these boil down to one key issue: polygamy or monogamy. That's really what all of this boils down to. And by the way, let's also point out, every one of these examples, where do they come from? What part of the Bible do we find them in? The Old Testament. They all come from the Mosaic Law. Interestingly, That is a period in human history that Jesus refers to as the hardness of your hearts in Matthew 19 and verse 8. He reminds them that from the beginning it hath not been so, and therefore he restores it back to the original. What was God's original plan for marriage? One man, one woman for life. That's what you go back to, and you look at the garden. God didn't create a bunch of different wives for Adam, right? He created one. So where did polygamy come from? It comes from man. As a matter of fact, we've got the first polygamist we read about in the Bible. Anybody have to remember who it is? It's a man by the name of Lamech. We read about him starting in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 19. He is from the line of Cain, which broadly speaking, you follow the line of Seth and the line of Cain, both descending from Adam and Eve. The line of Seth is sometimes referred to as the godly line, the faithful line, the covenant line. Cain's line is the one that is rebellious. And Lamech, we read about him in Genesis 4 and verse 19, he's the first polygamist. He takes two wives. But now notice something else about the character of this man we read in Genesis 4 verses 23 and 24. He tells his wives, I have slain a man for wounding me, and a young man for bruising me. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. This is, if Bad Leroy Brown had been written about 6,000 years ago, it would have been written about Lamech. That's what he's saying here. He said, look, I'm a bad man. Don't mess with me. He's the one that invented polygamy. It did not come from God. And further, polygamy is not permitted under the Christian era. You go back and you look at 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 2. Paul says, because of fornications, let each man have what? His own wife. How many in number? One, singular. Let each wife have what? Her own husband. One, singular in number. So, how many persons are in a marriage? Yeah. See, I asked the question the way that I did. I put some stress on the term persons because there are three persons in every marriage, aren't there? Man, woman, and who? God. It's not a person? Oh. That may be a bit of semantics. Traditionally, God would be argued as a person in the sense of he has a personality, he has will, he has intellect, he has emotions, he has all of those other attributes as a person. He does not have a physical body. And the reason I say how many persons instead of how many people, I would say God is not a people, but I would say he's a person. That may be we're probably splitting some semantic hairs there and getting a little bit deeper than we want to. But the point that I want to emphasize, whatever the terminology you want to go with, I wanted to emphasize is the fact that God is to be a partner in every marriage. According to Matthew 19 and verse 6, who does the joining in a marriage? God. It's not the husband and wife joining themselves to one another. It's also, by the way, not the state joining man and husband, or man and wife to one another. It is God doing the joining. And because God is instrumental in forming the marriage, what does that also imply? He's instrumental in dissolving the marriage or ending the marriage if that should be necessary. So, point number one, marriage is from God. Point number two, it is one man, one woman joined by God. Question number three, what is the duration of marriage? Well, first of all, let's note, marriage bonds do not continue after death. I know that can be kind of a sensitive subject because of how close marriage bonds are to us in this life, and existence in this life is all we know, right? And so if you have been married to your spouse for 40, 50, 60 years, the idea that your relationship in the next life is going to somehow be different, that can be a frightening prospect. And yet Jesus, when he was asked about the nature of the husband and wife relationship by the Sadducees in Matthew chapter 22, they put out this hypothetical situation of levirate marriage ad nauseum, where a woman has been married to 7 different brothers. So whose wife is she going to be in the resurrection? And what was Jesus' response to them? Do you remember? None of them. Because in the resurrection, he says, Matthew 22 and verse 29, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as angels in heaven. Those marriage bonds end at death. Consequently, and again, I know this could be kind of a sensitive subject, but consequently, the widowed are free to remarry, right? That's what Paul tells us, Romans 7, verses 2 and 3. The woman that hath a husband is bound by law to the husband while he liveth. But if the husband die, she is discharged from the law of the husband. So then, if while her husband liveth, she be joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if the husband die, she is free from the law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be joined to another man. Again, I know that's a sensitive topic, and I know that personal preference plays a role in it, but if the widow or the widower decides to remarry, they should feel no guilt about it. I would also suggest to you, just my opinion, as somebody who's been married for a little while, obviously I've not been married as long as everybody else in here, this is something that we should probably discuss with our spouse about what our expectations are and what our hopes for them are if we should depart. Because like we talked about in our grief study, odds are about 50-50 that one of you is going to end up widowed or widowed. All right? Very rarely do both partners die at the same time. So that may be something that we want to be considering before the time comes. But what about the terminating of a marriage before death? Well, the Bible does tell us that one may separate from the spouse for any reason, but what? They're not free to remarry. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 and 11. But unto the married I give charge, yea, not I, but the Lord, that the wife depart not from her husband, but should she depart, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband leave not his wife. Can you leave your husband? Can you leave your wife? You can. But then what are your choices? To go back to them, to reconcile somehow, or to remain unmarried. The only reason given in the Scriptures, the New Testament, by which one may leave their current spouse and be married to another is because of fornication. We see that in Matthew 19 and verse 9. Whosoever shall put away his wife except for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And he that marrieth her when she is put away committeth adultery. Now, some, as we sort of alluded to earlier in this class, desire to limit the force of this statement to Christians only, so that one may divorce and remarry as many times as they like to before becoming a Christian, and then their current marriage, whichever number they're on, is sanctified by their baptism and by their conversion. But consider, first of all, that position denies the universal authority of Jesus Christ and his message. How much authority does Jesus have? All authority in heaven and on earth, right? That's what he says, Matthew 28 and verse 18. So who is left exempt from the authority of Jesus Christ? No one. As a matter of fact, he says, John 12 and verse 48, even he that rejecteth me and receiveth not my sayings hath one that judgeth him. What is it that will judge him? The word that I have spoken. It doesn't matter if you're not a Christian. It doesn't matter if you rejected Christ outright. You are still amenable to the authority of Christ. Secondly, it denies the plain meaning of Jesus' statement. Matthew 19 and verse 9, Jesus' words begin with whosoever. How far-reaching is that word, whosoever? Everybody. Let me give you a good illustration of that. Everybody knows this verse, right? For God so loved the world that whosoever believeth on him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Who is excluded from John 3 and verse 16? I would suggest to you humbly the same number of people that are excluded from Matthew 19 and verse Marriage, remember, was originally given by God to all mankind, so all mankind are amenable to His definition and legislation. I'm not going to get through all of this afternoon. Let's consider this one. What is the nature of marriage? By that I mean, is marriage a civil union, a religious union, part of both? Okay. All right. I think we'd all agree with that one. I believe, and help me here if I'm missing something, that in truth it's going to contain elements of both. And let me explain what I mean by that. First of all, we understand one can be married in the eyes of the law, but an adulterer in the eyes of God. We see that in Matthew 19 and verse 9. The person was divorced, they've remarried, so in the laws of the land, and according to the law of the land, they're not a bigamist. They're not involved in polyandry. They just have the one spouse, but God says, no, you're an adulterer. One can be unmarried in the eyes of the law, but still be married to their original spouse in the eyes of God. Again, 1 Corinthians 7, 10 and 11, but unto the married I give charge, yea, not I, but the Lord, that the wife depart not from her husband, but should she depart, let her remain unmarried. Now, in what sense is she unmarried? She doesn't live with him, but I'm saying between the legal and the spiritual, in what sense is she unmarried? Legally, she's unmarried, but if she's spiritually unmarried, then she would be free to go marry whoever she wants to, right? She's unmarried in the eyes of the law, she's still married in the eyes of God. But must one be married in the eyes of the law to be married in the eyes of God? I'm going to suggest to you they should be. And here is why. First of all, civil authorities should be obeyed. Let every soul be in subjection to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Romans 13 and verse 1. But then also, social decency is to be maintained. Paul tells us, Romans 12 and verse 17, take thought for the things honorable in the sight of all men. I believe there is both a societal and a religious, or a civil and a religious component to marriage, that we should do our very best to adhere to both of them. Last point, and we won't get through all of these this afternoon, and maybe, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, what was the purpose of marriage? Why does God give us marriage? Well, the first one already popped up, and it ought to be pretty obvious. Because you go back to the very beginning in the initial institution of marriage, why was it formed? So man would not be alone. We also see Genesis 2 and verse 24, God saying that therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Quite likely, it seems that the ideal solution, I'm not saying it's a necessary solution or the only solution, but the ideal solution for loneliness and the need for social interaction is a spouse. Similarly, how close should that relationship be? It ought to be the closest human relationship you have. If you are married, your closest friend ought to be your spouse. Closer than the relationship between you and your parents, closer than the relationship between you and your children. I typically tell people, when I counsel with them before a marriage, you've got a young man and a young woman, they're engaged, they're wanting to be married. I don't do that without having some counseling with them. And one of the things I like to point out to them is that if you've got a social need that's not being met in your marriage, and I'm not saying that husband and wife have to do everything together, but generally speaking, if there is a social need that is not being met by your spouse, there's at least something there we need to investigate and we need to talk about some, because there very well may be a serious problem there. I'd also say that if you are closer to someone than you are to your spouse, there's probably a problem there. And our marriage could be deeper than what it is. I've got a few more points, Lord willing, 1, 2, 3. I've got 3 more quick points I want to look at under this idea of the purpose of marriage. And then, Lord willing, we'll also talk next week about some ways to maximize our marriages. So I hope you'll be back with us next week. Bring a friend. Thank you.
I want to grab a songbook. We'll sing number 990. Before Brother Serge comes back and speaks to us for just a moment. You are the words and the music. You are the song that I sing. You are the melody. You are the harmony. Praise to your name I will bring. You are the Lord of lords. You are the mighty God. You are the King of all kings. So now I give back to you the song that you gave to me. You are the song that I sing. You are the words and the music. You are the song that I sing. You are the melody. You are the harmony. Praise to your name I will bring. You are the Lord of lords. You are the mighty God. You are the King of all kings. So now I give back to you the song that you gave to me. You are the song that I sing. If you'll mark number 517, please. It'll be the song for your encouragement. 517.
On January 31st, 1933, and I had to look up the date. I don't remember it because I wasn't alive then. But on January 31st, 1933, a new character appeared on radio. One who would go on to appear not just in radio programs, but television programs, comic books, and even movies. The Lone Ranger. I kind of wish whoever had that ringtone earlier could have had the William Tell overture instead of the Good, Bad, the Ugly. That really would have been perfect. Regardless of the medium, the character of the Lone Ranger was always presented in broadly the same way. That lone force for good, standing against evil, hence the Lone Ranger. But that name was also very much a misnomer because, you see, even the Lone Ranger had Tonto. As a matter of fact, I went back and read about this. The originators of the character, the Lone Ranger, they wanted him to have somebody to talk to. And so they developed also the character of Tonto to be a faithful companion, friend, and sidekick. You know, too often in our lives, we try to approach things as a literal Lone Ranger. We've got to do it ourselves or it won't be done, or at least it won't be done the right way. We refuse to ask for help or we refuse to accept help because we think that would be an admission of weakness, that we could not do something on our own. We demand everything of ourselves, and if our everything isn't sufficient for a task, if we have bitten off more than we can chew, we often lapse into despair because we are not enough, and the project, we feel like, just won't be done. We burn ourselves out. We destroy our satisfaction and our peace. We give up. And then nothing gets done. You remember in Exodus chapter 18 when Jethro observed Moses trying to personally judge every dispute among the entire nation of Israel. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, said unto him, The thing that thou doest is not good. Thou wilt surely wear away both thou and this people that is with thee, for the thing is too heavy for thee. Thou art not able to perform it thyself. Exodus 18, verses 17 and 18. Notice carefully what Jethro is telling his son-in-law here. He says, look, trying to be a lone ranger is going to wear you out, Moses, and it's also going to wear out the people. I think we readily understand how something like that would wear out Moses, but how is he also wearing away the people? Well, the people weren't being used, or I should say the willing people weren't being used. And when willing people aren't being used, they'll stop being willing eventually. The abilities of the people weren't being utilized. And abilities that aren't utilized and aren't used soon will atrophy. The talents of others weren't being developed, and Moses wouldn't be with them forever. So who takes over once Moses is gone? It seems to me that in every endeavor, ultimately, there is a need for a tanto. Solomon tells us that two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth, and hath not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, then they have warmth. But how can one be warm alone? And if a man prevail against him that is alone, two shall withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. Ecclesiastes 4, verses 9 through 12. Seeking and accepting help will allow more work to be done. Seeking and accepting help will multiply our strength so that greater challenges can be overcome. Seeking and accepting help will protect us from dangers like burnout, and seeking and accepting help will enable the work to continue. Some of the very last words that Paul writes to his protege Timothy are these: The things which thou hast heard from me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. 2 Timothy 2, verse 2. You know, this is one of those reasons that Paul was always taking with him a John Mark or a Timothy. He's training his replacement. He's not trying to do it all by himself. So what does all of this sort of boil down to then, practically speaking? Well, practically speaking, we need to accept that we cannot and do not have to do everything on our own. Help is available to us. If studying the Bible with another person seems too scary, ask someone to go with you and help. If you don't think you can teach a Bible class on your own, offer to assist someone else. Learn by watching and doing. And when you find yourself overwhelmed with a task, ask for help. We also need to be looking for other people whose talents and potential we can help unlock. We need to be looking for ways to involve more people in the work, and we can start by inviting them to assist us. But most of all, we need to realize the foolishness and indeed the hopelessness of trying to get our lives right on our own. We refuse to open up to one another and to seek the help from one another, partly from shame, but partly also from pride. But can I ask a question and make an observation, a suggestion? How long have you been trying to make this change, whatever it might be, on your own? How's it working out for you? Maybe it's time to try something new. I want you to notice what James says, James 5 and verse 16. We often split this verse, unfortunately, but it's one continuous thought. Confess, therefore, your sins one to another, and pray one for another, that ye may be healed. Continuing thought, the supplication of a righteous man availeth much in its working. We need to be praying for one another, trusting in one another, relying upon one another. And of course, worst of all, is when we refuse to come to God for help. People will say something to the effect of, I know that I'm wrong, and I know I need to come to God, but first I need to get this right in my life. Can I humbly observe that if you could get your life right, if you could do that, you wouldn't need to come to God. When we say, I've got to do this first, we are cutting ourselves off from the one who can help us best. We come to God because He is the one who can transform our lives. And He freely offers the help to do so to anyone willing to accept it. Will you accept it this evening? Do you realize that trying to get your life right on your own isn't working? Come to God and accept the help He offers. Do you need to give your life to Christ? Repenting of your sins, confessing your faith in Jesus as the Son of God, and then in obedience with the gospel, being washed of your sins in the waters of baptism. God will take away all of your sins. He'll transform your life this evening if you'll only come to Him. You need to come back to God. You need to maybe ask the forgiveness, the help, the assistance of your brethren. Then please come. The Lord's invitation is yours this evening. If you will, come while we stand and while we sing.
Oh, do not let the word depart, and close thine eyes against the light. O sinner, harden not thy heart. Be saved, oh, tonight. Oh, why not tonight? Oh, why not tonight? Wilt thou be saved? Then why not tonight? Tomorrow's sun may never rise to bless thy long deluded sight. This is the time, oh, then be wise. Be saved, oh, tonight. Oh, why not tonight? Oh, why not tonight? Wilt thou be saved? Then why not tonight? Our blessed Lord refuses none. Who would to Him their souls unite? Believe, obey, the work is done. Be saved, oh, tonight. Oh, why not tonight? Oh, why not tonight? Thou be saved, then why not tonight? Be seated, please. Is there anyone who is unable to partake of the Lord's Supper this morning?
Have no new announcements this evening, just review what we mentioned this morning. Let's remember Tony Willis resuming his cancer treatments this week, Lorinda Sellers recovering from her nerve block, TJ's stepfather Jeff Sloat waiting on his biopsy results. Soul Sisters, remember the meeting at the Finleys Tuesday evening. Be back here for Bible classes Wednesday night. Leveda's Beta's 92nd birthday on Wednesday. I know she'd appreciate some cards. Saturday evening, the Reelfoot fish fry and spaghetti supper to benefit Reelfoot Youth Camp. And then next Sunday evening, following our evening Bible class, the reception to honor our high school graduates. Hope you can be a part of all of that. TJ, you have a closing song?
Close us out tonight. We'll sing the first verse of number 48, Anywhere with Jesus, after which we'll be led in prayer by Brother Billy McVeigh. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere he leads me in this world below. Anywhere without him dearest joys would fade. Anywhere with Jesus I am not afraid. Anywhere, anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go.
Our Father in heaven, we come to you again in prayer, thanking you for this day and for all our many wonderful blessings. Father, we're so thankful that we were all able to come out again once this evening to learn more about thy word and sing praises to thy name. Father, we just pray that everything that has been said and done here today has been in accordance with thy will. We can go out and apply it to everyday walks of life so we can be better Christians in the future than we have been in the past. Father, we pray now for all those that are privileged to pray for that are sick and unable to be here. Father, we just ask you that you'll be with the ones waiting upon them, nurse them back to health so they can be back to us once again. Father, we just pray that you'll go with us all. We're about to leave this place. Bring us back next